Hello, Foreign Entanglements viewers. My name is Rob Farley from the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. With me today is Colin Snider. How are you doing this morning, Colin?
I'm doing fine, and yourself?
I am doing perfectly. Can you remind us of your affiliation and everything else?
Yes, I'm Colin Snider. I'm Assistant Professor of Latin American History at the University of Texas at Tyler.
Texas at Tyler. How is your weather?
It's pretty sunny today. We had a really fierce storm blow through the other night, but it's sunny, brisk, but sunny today.
Cool. I should note that we are recording this on Friday after Duke Day. Every year, all of America, except for a very small part of North Carolina, celebrates the defeat of the Duke Blue Devils in the NCAA championships, and that happened last night at the hands of my beloved Oregon Ducks. So after Duke Day, everyone, clasp hands for after Duke Day. So anyway, in sort of more consequential news. Brazil is going through, and you specialize in Brazilian politics and Brazilian history. Brazil is going through what appears to be just a spasm of catastrophe. So what's going on right now?
The short version is sort of the massive eruption and outrage over a number of issues, a corruption scandal, a worsening economy, and it's kind of led to this very dubious push for the ouster of the president, who is currently Dilma Rousseff, the first woman president in Brazil. And so there's a lot of turmoil going on over what's very much political machinations and struggle over who's in charge. And I would argue, I'll probably put the cart before the horse here, but I would argue this is as much about sort of the entrenched elites who have historically remained generally impuned, operating in a system of impunity, finding that system no longer working in their favor, and that you've had for the last, we're now at what, starting in 2003, basically started 2003, so we're in our 13th year of a president from the centrist left Workers' Party, which has done no small amount of really incredible social redistribution programs that have helped a majority of Brazil's poor who have typically been politically marginalized. So I think what we're sort of seeing here is a lot of pushback from this more we'd say in Portuguese, donos de poder, right? The owners of power, literally, the sort of upper class and the middle class who pretend that they could be upper class, not liking this kind of social recalibration and basically expressing this through partisan politics and an impeachment push. And there are very real problems. Like corruption is a massive scandal. We can return to this. The economy has really worsened, but this has sort of led to this very uncertain. So basically, like if I may draw on a riverine analogy for Brazil, so a couple of rivers all coming together into one really massive slog of controversy and mess.
All right, so let's step back a second. So what kicked off, and so, obviously, as you suggest, there are some much broader trend lines going on, which have led us to this situation. On the political and the corruption-themed side, what kicked off? Was it the threat to arrest Lula that kicked it off? But there were concerns before that, right? There were protests before that, as Lula being the former president. So when did this current crisis reach crisis proportions? Really,
it's sort of after the 2014 elections, right? That Dilma Rousseff was reelected in 2014, and what was I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I believe is the closest election the PT has won in those last 4 elections. And so, what really kicks it off, though, is there's this emerging Petrobras scandal that you have at the heart of all of this corruption investigation is a program called Operation Car Wash in Portuguese, named after a car wash that was used to sort of launder money. And as it was sort of being investigated over the past 2 years, it becomes quite clear that the state-run oil company, Petrobras, as well as some major national corporations, including Odebrecht, which is an enormous construction company that operates in Brazil, but is a multinational company based in Brazil, had basically been providing kickbacks and bribes to politicians. And so they're sort of unwinding, there's this thread that they tug on to unravel that keeps, the sweater keeps coming undone effectively, in which more and more politicians' names are coming up. And the thing that sort of leads to Dilma Rousseff being under suspicion here a little bit from her opposition is she was the chair of the board of executives for Petrobras from 2003 to 2000, I forget these, around 2002, 3 to 2010, I want to say, but that might be wrong. I might be wrong on the dates, but she was there when a lot of this process was apparently taking place. Now, to be clear, it's a process that actually goes back to the late 90s. So this is part of the problem with why this push for her impeachment now is partly partisan-driven, is because this is a scandal that has its origins under the presidency of Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who's from the center-right, right-wing-ish PSDB party, the Brazilian Social Democratic Party. And then it continues under Lula and then under Dilma, apparently. But I say that with the major caveat of it continues under them in the sense that this is happening while they are presidents.
Right.
But the degree to which any of them may or may not have known about this is really unclear. And there's been a lot that has been uncovered in terms of corruption and kickbacks and payoffs. And to date, her name has never appeared in any of this, nor has Lua's, right? They just had this release the other night. That company I mentioned, Odebrecht, right? Mm-hmm. Their CEO was arrested last year, tried, and he was just sentenced to 19 years in jail a couple weeks ago for this. And so he agreed to work with the government in sort of a plea deal now. And one of the things that just happened Wednesday night, or Wednesday during the day, a list of over 300 names, I believe. I haven't done an exact count, but about 300 names at least, with politicians and money amounts given to them. And some of them are immediately fleeing, saying, oh no, it's part of a regular campaign donation. And some have already pointed out that we've seen your campaign donations, and that number isn't this number. Her name's not on it. Lula's name's not on it. Fernando Henrique Cardoso's name's not on it, right? And none of the former presidents are on there. It tends to be more congressmen or past presidential candidates, ironically for the PSDB, who are leading the charge against her. And we can come back because this is a really complicated issue. And then and the thing that really surprised me looking at the list is the number of municipal and state level politicians also receiving money. So mayors, state legislative representatives, governors, and it's across party lines, right? There's 24 political parties at least had somebody on that list. Some parties more than others, but 24 parties too. So this isn't just a problem of the PT, although it's being framed like that in this impeachment push.
Right. So, I mean, first, the way you describe it reminds me of the film The Untouchables, where they recover this ledger, and they try to take apart the ledger in the courtroom, and it has all of these lists of judges and all of them and everything in it, and this document sounds like that. I mean, so I guess would this be a good way to frame it, right? That there is a generalized corruption problem and a sharper corruption particular scandal, and that this scandal is being weaponized for partisan politics, and it looks like successfully weaponized for partisan politics by one of the parties in particular.
Absolutely, yeah. I would say it's almost a perfect characterization, with the exception of its successful weaponization, right? That there's been an attempt to successfully weaponize it, and part of what you've seen is lots of people in the streets, generally from the upper classes and the middle classes, generally white, generally well off, that there was a major protest in Sao Paulo on March 13th, and 77% of that population has college education. And when you look at the city of Sao Paulo more generally, 28% of the whole population has college education. So we're dealing with privileged classes here. So they've tried, but the problem is a lot of the people leading the charge in this partisan push have been directly implicated. That on the one hand, one of the major figures you have is the Speaker of Brazil's Chamber of Deputies, the lower house of the Congress. His name's Eduardo Cunha. He's from the very big tent center PMDB, the Democratic Movement, Brazilian Democratic Movement Party. It's an enormous tent that hasn't ever had a president, but has basically been the kingmaker then in these coalition building projects in the Congress, that you have to give them a lot in exchange for them approving your legislative plan, whether you're from the right or the left. And so he's been leading the charge. He's been under investigation. There's been multi-million-dollar bank accounts belonging to him under other names found in Switzerland and under their pretexts. He's actually been directly implicated in multiple corruption scandals, and here he is leading the charge for impeachment. So that there's this suggestion that he's doing this in part because he's trying to take the heat off himself. With the release of those names, right? That the person who lost to Dilma in 2014, his name's Aécio Neves. He's the grandson of a famous Brazilian politician, and he's been sort of the face of how the PT is corrupt as well, and he's the head of the PSDB party, and his name pops up in that ledger. And he's been connected to past corruption scandals that have been sort of whitewashed and brushed away by the judiciary, and in fact. The three main spokespersons for Fernando Henrique Cardoso is the still sort of father figure of the PSDB because he founded that party. But across the last 4 elections, there have been 3 men who've run for president. José Serra for the PSDB in 2002, Geraldo Alckmin, who's now governor of São Paulo, in 2006, Serra again in 2010, and then Neves in 2014, and all 3 of them have their names popping up in that ledger as well. So it's been a real big push on the one hand, to have her removed from conservative sectors and from the middle classes, or a lot of the urban middle class and upper class. But there's also been not necessarily pro-government protests, but they're framing it as an anti-coup attempt, like a pro-democracy attempt, that they don't support the government and knows it needs to be better, but that these efforts to remove the president are baseless. And sort of calling out that you can't go to the streets saying you're against corruption while celebrating these men, that you're not against corruption, this is a partisan project.
Right.
So there has been, and that part hasn't been covered in the Brazilian media, that they celebrate the people taking the streets against the president because they're very much aligned with that project. But there's also been a lot of sort of popular pushback saying, even if this is a bad economy and a bad system, we elected her and you can't just get rid of somebody because you don't like them.
Right. Now, so what is the structure of the Brazilian media so what do we need to know about the Brazilian media to tell us, like, why and how it's approaching this crisis and this scandal?
It's historically conservative, that your largest news outlet, media outlet is Global News, Global Channel. They've got print media. The thing that's always, people always point to is, and I suppose it is important, is Global really becomes a powerful media. So almost the main sort of, imagine if Fox News had an even greater audience and Murdoch had a greater presence in the United States. That's Global. And they came to power by basically being in bed with the dictatorship. That they sort of offer a very favorable portrayal of Brazil's military dictatorship from 1964 to 85, and in return the dictatorship basically shuts out other media under censorship laws to give Global greater space to expand. And so they've historically been super conservative in their and very anti-popular classes in their media portrayals. That in 1984, as Brazil's democratizing, the way Brazil, I don't want to go too far down this road, but the way Brazil democratizes, it was set to be still an indirect presidential election in 1985. So you have this huge push from 1983 to 84 for direct elections, that the people want to vote now. And you have what's up to that point the biggest rally culminating in Sao Paulo in 1984 with over 1 million people gathering at this rally, and Globo doesn't cover it. And then only sort of has to blatantly acknowledge that it happened after all the other media not only pointing out that it happened, but that Globo's not covering it. In the 1989 elections, which are direct, you have Lula da Silva running for president for the first time. And he's running against Fernando Collor, who's very sort of typical politician. His father famously killed a man in Congress, like on the floor of the Congress. And he's running as sort of this newcomer, and Global videos the debates, but they don't televise them live, and they basically edit it so that the worst parts of Lula come out and the best parts of Collor come out, and the actual policies that Lula floats that would be popular aren't aired. And then Collor barely beats Lula.
So this is something like
there's a historical
from The Simpsons,
legacy.
right? Where they're that's a very adulterous answer, and
and there's even a documentary that somebody made about the guy who created or sort of ran O Globo, Roberto Marinho, and I forget the title off the top of my head now. I want to say it's something like Beyond Citizen Kane or The Real Citizen Kane or something. They made it, and he managed to get it censored and prohibited in Brazil. And now, thanks to the miracle of things like YouTube, they can watch it. But yeah, it was made for Brazilians to sort of show how the history of this process has played out, and then it got censored by that same media outlet.
So this characterizes then kind of the broader media. So what is the situation then? What are the broader economic factors that are going on right now? Because you talked about the deteriorating economy. Is the problem one kind of a general one associated with commodity sell-off, right? I mean, how important is oil to
it's oil. It's really oil. It's the global oil prices have dropped, and China's economy is shaken, and of course China has gotten more invested in Latin America more generally. So it's sort of that old cliche of China sneezes and the world catches a cold. And so it's not that Brazil's caught a cold yet, because under what part of the thing is under Lula, and then to a lesser extent, but still continued under Dilma, he did a really good job of diversifying Brazil's economic relations. That up until Lula, it's primarily the United States and Europe are Brazil's major trading partners since the colonial era. But he sets out to all right, start making deals with China, start making deals with countries in Africa. So and that's one of the reasons why Brazil is actually able to weather the global recession in 2008 so quickly, that they're the last country into recession and the first one out, and it's one quarter. Because of this, but China did play a big enough role that as it's contracting and oil prices at the same time drop, and Brazil's got this state-run oil company, Petrobras, which again has been also apparently tied into these corruption scandals. But it's also just the commodities markets shaking, and the sort of typical financial institutions that would step in to save the day in the past, which of course they never did, right? It's always highly exploitative. But so your U.S. Western banking institutions start downgrading Brazil more and more, which makes the economy look more skittish, which makes investment flowing into Brazil less, which only exacerbates the problem. So it's sort of this really dramatically worsening economy that's shrunk really rapidly. And this is after Brazil had really had a boom from about 2003 to 2010-11. And so you had what looked like finally Brazil coming out of this long history of economic peaks and valleys, like really dramatic peaks and valleys, even by economic standards. And
Brazil always being on a cusp of a boom, right?
Right, yeah.
What the phrase is exactly.
Brazil is the country of tomorrow forever. Is the joke, right? And it looked like it was finally the country of tomorrow today, and then this sort of economic collapse has happened. And of course, and this is totally logical to politics. It's illogical from a philosophical viewpoint, but logical in terms of human behavior. The economy worsens, and you blame the president, even though she's got very little control over global commodity prices. She's not dictating the shape of the oil market on the global level. So that also merges that, and so you have people calling for corruption like, oh, well, the economy's bad. Well, that's great, but that's not an impeachable offense.
Right. So, I mean, what are the pathways out of here? So, obviously, to call this a concern is probably to overstate it, but it's obviously an interest, right? I mean, we do have a major, event coming up in Brazil in the next few months. What is the pathway forward for this crisis right now? I mean, it doesn't seem, from the way you describe it, it doesn't seem that that it's likely to lead to a presidential resignation, but
yeah, she's been very clear on that. She just had an interview published yesterday. She's not resigning. She'll take every legal path available to contest any efforts towards impeachment. Yeah,
right. But we're also, I presume, we're also not heading towards Syrian civil war territory, right? I mean,
no. The path out is the $1 million question, or the $1 billion question at this point, because what the car wash scandal has, the Operação Lava Jato has revealed, is just something that everyone knew, is sort of in the back of their minds. Like, in your hearts that corruption is still an important issue in Brazil, but even those of us who study this historically, it's sort of mind-numbing how deeply entrenched it is, right? Again, when you're dealing with the municipal levels and the state levels, and it's 24 parties, everyone from the far-right Democratic Party in Brazil, because the Democratic Party in Brazil is far-right, and then the PSDB is just sort of barely to their left, to the Communist Party of Brazil, and the Socialist Party of Brazil, that with all of these different people, it reveals just how entrenched and systematic the scandal is. And so the problem is, an impeachment's not going to fix this. And this is one of the biggest breaks on that, on the probability of her being impeached. As well, a majority of Brazil's population actually supports her being impeached. And I don't mean to suggest false consciousness, because I hate that idea, but I think that's also very much shaped by the media narratives they're being given. But the problem is, if you impeach her, the vice president becomes president, but he's been tied to all these scandals. And if he doesn't get to be president, it's supposed to be Cunha, who, as I said before, is the speaker of the president of the Chamber of Deputies. He's definitely got implications. And if it's not him, the fourth in succession is the president of the Senate, who's Renan Calheiros, who's also tied to all of this and had already had to resign from Senate once in 2007 over corruption. So it's just basically, it's sort of like, instead of turtles all the way down, it's corruption all the way down. And so if you impeach Dilma, like, who's going to be president? Because if she's out, everyone's going to go after the next person, and so on and so forth. So the way out, I don't know, because it would require such an institutional overhaul that this isn't going to be fixed quickly. I think what it's going to take at best is several years of better elections and better transparency. And I'm rarely an optimist, but I find something strangely encouraging in all of this too, because for the first time, this is all becoming really public, right? That the judiciary has acted dubiously in the last couple of weeks, and we can return to that if we need to. But for the first 2 years of the car wash investigation, it had done a really good job of being meticulous, sort of not protecting the elites, and not just doing it because, not going out to lunch with them and then saying there's nothing here to see. And this stuff becoming public, and even the power of the internet, so that the documents that were released on Wednesday with that ledger, a judge belatedly said, I'm sealing that now, but it's out on the internet, and everyone's been able to go through this and write about it. And so I think in some regards, I mean, keep in mind, Brazilian democracy as we know it now is only 31 years old. That it returns to democracy in 1985, and it doesn't have a real long history of democracy prior to 1964 either. So in part, some are framing this as growing pains, and they're very painful growing pains, I suppose, but I actually find something mildly encouraging in that in the past, we learned about all these corruption. Either this corruption was like, oh yeah, everyone's corrupt, what are you going to do? Or we only learned about the degree of corruption through historical research. And now it's happening right now. That won't automatically galvanize the public to necessarily figure out better. And then sort of the pessimist side of me says, maybe this just teaches the politicians to be smarter and not making this that obvious. But the way out is going to have to be really a sort of a change in culture and climate.
So when is the next how much longer is Dilma's term?
She still has 2 more years.
2 more years. So.
Next presidential, 2.5 really, because the next presidential elections will be in fall of 2018, and then inauguration is always in January of the following year.
Right. So, I mean, is there a potential, and I hate to drag this back to the question of the Olympics, right? But
sure.
There have been cases in other countries where, the prospect of the Olympics has sort of catalyzed, either political change or political repression. And so I'm immediately thinking of Mexico in '68.
Yeah.
Is there a prospect that, people wanting to get all this, whatever we would mean by wrapped up, but to sort of catalyze a shift, that the Olympics would drive some sort of, intensification of the crisis or resolution of the crisis or anything along those lines?
It's difficult to say. I mean, because if the impeachment goes forward, it could lead to impeachment going forward because the world's eyes are increasingly on Brazil, both through the Olympics and through this sort of the depth of this scandal. So you've had things like The Economist or The Guardian just this past week saying, Dilma's got to go, which is really...
The Guardian came out and
said that. Well, the Observer, so I guess it's their Sunday version.
Right.
And that's just really, I mean, as I joked on Twitter the other day, like, how would England feel if they were having an economic crisis and Brazil told them that they've got to remove their leader? And of course, it's parliamentary, so England can actually decide that for themselves. But this is just how presidencies work. Like, you don't get to do this. But the problem is, coming back to the Brazilian media, they love to write about how is the world talking about them. So that the moment that The Guardian and The Economist are saying this, it's getting published in Brazilian media in Portuguese that others, quote, the implication being civilized countries who know what they're doing want her to go. So this is what we have to do. So I think that could possibly be a factor as that intensifies of what's at stake in terms of how might that shape the political atmosphere going forward. But again, I don't see Dilma in particular. First of all, the impeachment hasn't begun. That she would have to, and even if it does, if she's under charges of impeachment, she's got to leave office, sort of step down while she faces these charges. And again, that puts Temer back in power, which is a very dubious proposition. So I think, ultimately, there's going to be a lot of, and I could be totally wrong on this because I'm a historian and we're not so good with the future, but
or the present.
Yeah, sometimes, yeah. But I think if she has to deal with this in the Olympics, it's going to be an even worse look. And I think a lot of Brazilians, as much as they don't like the way they look now, understand that it looks even worse for the Olympics. That maybe the Olympics can kind of be a salve rather than, and a distraction from all of this rather than worsening things as it approaches. I don't think we'll see the kinds of repression that you see in Mexico in 1968 because she's stubborn, but she's also, I mean, keep in mind, she is a former victim of the dictatorship herself, that she had been arrested and tortured and interrogated and imprisoned. And so certainly there's repression and violence in Brazil, and it's generally at the level of the military police and at the state levels. But I don't see a sort of either that kind of crackdown or a military step in to remove her from office just as the Olympics are happening.
Right. And I guess the other reason, that it's no longer 1968, right? And it's simply not possible to undertake the kind of repression that the Mexican government did.
Yeah.
And the Brazilian media and societal context make it very difficult to pull off what the Chinese did in 2008, right?
And because she's president and the media is so opposed to her, they'll be on that in a heartbeat.
Right.
Like if it were their president, maybe they wouldn't report it as quickly in Brazil, but because she's not, that would be a story immediately in Brazil as well.
Right. So the short answer is we don't really know, but it'll be interesting watching going forward.
Yeah, absolutely, because it keeps changing. I mean, 3 weeks ago, I look back, it starts on March 4th, where all of a sudden Lula is getting taken to an airport for police questioning under a higher police presence than when he was a union leader during the dictatorship and got arrested. That the government of Sao Paulo used greater force under democracy than the military dictatorship had used in arresting him as a labor leader. And that comes back. I do think this is worth highlighting, the question of the judiciary in this process, because you have this judge who's been a young judge, Sergio Moro, who'd been behind basically most of the investigations, or a major actor in most of the investigations in Operação Lava Jato, in the Operation Car Wash, and sort of giving the judicial approval for these kinds of searches, right? That this isn't just an arbitrary thing, that they're operating constitutionally. And that had gone well until this arrest of Lula, and he's in question for a couple of hours and then set free, but it's really kind of abusive. And then he's sort of worried about how this is looking. So Dilma says she's going to appoint him to be her chief of staff, basically.
Which
because
immunizes him, right? Is that correct?
yeah, pretty much. It means he can't be members of the cabinet can't be tried by the court system. It's like the regular courts; they can only be tried by the Supreme Court, and that usually takes a lot longer. So, and I think I don't want to say that was a misstep, but I can see why that's a bad look for her, and it is puzzling, right? Because in so doing, it looks in this climate where people are already suspicious of corruption, it looks like she's doing this in a sort of semi-corrupt fashion to protect him. But the flip side of that being, he's also facing this really strange sudden sort of push against him without any real evidence of massive corruption. There's something that's come out since about a possible apartment or land ownership issue, but she sort of frames it as this is to make sure you get a fair shake because clearly the system is now turned against you. And Morrow had their phone conversations taped, which is possibly illegal. What was definitely illegal was within hours of that conversation where they're talking about this and she says she'll send him the paperwork just in case, which is a very vague sentence, just in case he needs to be ready to hit the job now. It could have been, right? Or it could be just in case you need to show it to the police. Morrow releases that within hours of that conversation happening, leaks it to the public. And that's probably unconstitutional illegal, right? That because this is dealing with the presidency now, because it's her, that should have gone to the Supreme Court. And you have some Supreme Court justice saying, you're stepping beyond your bounds now, right? So that this guy who had been very professional and sort of judicious in his actions up to this point is suddenly making decisions that look far more partisan. And then again, and he's the guy who wants to.
The way you describe it, it could be read either partisan, but it could also be read as zealous or overzealous, right? The way you have a prosecution or a judge go after a project that he's been part of for a while.
It could be both, and the other thing too, he's not the only one. So you have a Supreme Court justice who openly dines with people like Serra and with people like Neves, and on the one hand, he should be allowed to eat with whom he wants. But at the same time, he's a Supreme Court justice, and that's not a great look. It'd be like if Roberts was caught dining with your home state, Mitch McConnell, right before, in a fantasy world where we actually have a Supreme Court hearing. If Roberts is dining with McConnell right before, and even if they're just talking about their golf game, it doesn't look good. So it could be overly zealous. And the other thing that sort of makes it, at least cast the shadow of partisanship a little bit over it with regards to Morrow is, again, he's leaked all kinds of things, or all kinds of things that have been involved with his office have leaked to the public, and he didn't seal them. And, again, those tape recordings being the biggest example. And the moment a list comes out with a lot of PSDB party members' names included to a degree that people didn't really know before, he wants that one sealed now. And sort of leaking to the public instead of following a constitutional line. So it could be overzealotry. It could be a little bit, it's not clear what the factors are here, but there's at least the hint of, the perception is there for both of those. So that you're starting to see now what's making this more complicated is, because it's not complicated enough, but what's further complicating the issue is the judiciary starting to look a little less balanced, right? So a little less blind to justice. It looks like that the proverbial handkerchief is starting to look up, peek out from under it a little bit.
So, is there anything else you want to say about Brazil before because I know we also want to talk a little bit about Cuba, but is there anything else that we should know before moving on?
Yeah, well, I think because it's worth highlighting what the impeachment charges are against Gilma, actually, the things they're bringing forth, because it's not actually related directly to the Petrobras scandal itself, that this is flying around her, but that's not the things that they would like to impeach her for is they're saying that the biggest charges are that she sort of used state bank accounts to cover up deficit gaps as she was running for president, so she's fudging the numbers is the charge, right? That if there's
this is kind of like an Andrew Johnson, reasons to come up with to impeach Andrew Johnson.
Effectively, and so. And you're exactly, actually, it's a great analogy because the problem is they're saying like this is unconstitutional. She lied to the public while she was running for president. She did the exact same accounting practices that Lula had done and that Fernando Henrique Cardoso had done. Right, that the way she was using to present the numbers to the public isn't technically. This sounds terrible. It's not illegal. You can disagree with what it's implying, but she's not the first president to do this. And currently, 16 of 27 governors have elected in 2014 have done the exact same thing, and none of them is facing impeachment. Lula didn't face impeachment over this when he did it. Cardoso didn't face impeachment over this when he did it. And so, again, it comes back to this very. She's said that she thinks they're doing this because she's a woman that she's weak, but she's I'm not fragile, and so. That's what they're trying to get her on. But again, it comes back to just how silly this all looks is because if this hasn't been an impeachable offense until now, why is it suddenly now? And when it's, again, Cunha leading the charge, and there's been $5 million found in overseas bank accounts, and how did you get that as the president of the House of Deputy Chambers? Mm-hmm. It's not a good. You're building your case on sand. It's not real stable. So those are the charges she's actually facing impeachment for. It's not a question of Petrobras. It's not a question of these kickbacks from Odebrecht. None of that has been directly tied to her. It's really this question of what did she do with accounting and numbers for the federal budget in an election year.
Right. Oh, and so that is fascinating. So, I mean, really what you have going on within the protests and so forth is much more atmospheric, kind of, than having a direct implication on the impeachment. Now, so the process of impeachment would go through, is it like the United States in which there would be an indictment by one house and then a trial by the other house, or how does the process
and she would have to step down for this.
And so that's what's different about the U.S. In the U.S., because Clinton was still
Clinton
president.
continues serving president. She would not be serving as president. She'd have to sort of temporarily vacate the seat until the impeachment process was finished.
Now, is there any indication of what the timeline for that would be? How long that would last?
At least 6 months.
Oh, wow.
So, I mean, there's no real indication because the only other time this has happened was in 1992 in Color, that guy who beat Lula, thanks in no small part to heavily edited debate video footage. He actually wasn't massively corrupt. And funnily enough, he's now senator. He had his political rights stripped for 10 years. He got them restored after 10 years, ran for senator, and guess whose name is popping up in these corruption scandals? But there was one, so they didn't have impeachment in the really ready in the Constitution when that happened. They didn't even have a word in Portuguese for impeachment. They actually say impeachment because they didn't have one. And so he went through an impeachment process, started to go through an impeachment process, and was stripped of his rights, and he sort of stepped down. But that's the closest we've had, and it was a pretty open and shut case for him. And for her, it'd be a lot more difficult. So some are saying a minimum of 6 months, and that seems like a very charitable estimation.
Right. All right, so let's do this shift over, this jog over to this jog north, and somewhat to the east, to the big Obama trip to Cuba.
Yeah.
And I guess just a couple questions to kick us off. Right, one, what has the U.S. relationship with Cuba and the U.S. embargo towards Cuba meant in a sort of a pan-Latin American situation up to now, and how? What did you think of the visit, and how is this going to change sort of the optics of the U.S. relations with the South America more generally, America and Latin America?
So, since the end of the Cold War, Latin America has viewed the embargo as pretty silly, right? During the Cold War, because of sort of our relationship with Latin American countries, our aid in either creating or sponsoring after the fact right-wing dictatorships in places like Chile, Brazil. I always joke with students like count out Chile, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, Peru, all these different places of dictatorships and military regimes. And then that sort of mantra of anti-communism, which is very much, it's very easy to blame the United States for that, and we certainly push that, but you also have anti-communists in Latin America, right? So these are also homegrown movements, but they're easily willing to go along with the United States on this, and it's Mexico who's the outlier, that they sort of, in an effort to show a third way, they renew relations with Cuba during the Cold War. But after that, like most of the rest of the world, with the end of the Cold War, they view this as a ridiculous relic that really was ineffective during the Cold War and has no place in a post-Cold War context. And so most of Latin America has been very willing to work with Cuba. The trade deals, you obviously had people like Hugo Chavez sort of revitalizing the Cuban economy with oil money and sort of that alleged block between him and Ortega and in Ecuador. But even countries like Brazil or Argentina, certainly even before the end of the 90s, when you have right-wing presidents, or not right-wing, but more conservative neoliberal presidents in office, and certainly with the sort of quote-unquote pink tide from 2002-ish to the present, and we're starting to see a bit of a shift now, maybe. So there was already relationships. Everyone already viewed the United States as kind of this weird outlier who's just the kid who won't give up and doesn't realize when he's lost.
Now, was there here's a question, was there an understanding, because within the United States, I mean, we seem to sort of broadly understand this as being a function of electoral politics, right? At least a lot of people understand it, right? That it's not really the United States, it's more Florida, and we spend a lot of time apologizing for Florida in a lot of different contexts. But I mean, was there across Latin America, was there this understanding of that this was going on in the United States primarily as something as part of the electoral system, or
it's merely anecdotal? But my impression is no, that because sort of the ways that the United States has operated in Latin America more generally, that there was a less interest in or willingness to ascribe that to they have to cater to Florida. That this is just how the United States operates. This has been their thing for a long time. It's sort of the bully pulpit that's not terribly effective, and that this is just how the U.S. government operates. And so, yeah, I don't think there's been a lot of. I may be mistaken on this. There may be quantitative data out there to demonstrate this, but my experience has always been that the United States is kind of a monolith. So this is just the U.S. government doing what it does.
I think somebody could do a lot of good work in public diplomacy by just explaining America's problems as originating mostly in Florida, right? And this is pretty much all of them, right? I mean, you can ascribe so many of the problematic aspects of the United States to Florida, and conveying that to the international community, I think, is an important project for the future.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so, but now the thing is with Obama, I mean, with this visit, you asked sort of what's its impact. I think, because there's been all kinds of blowout, and I unfortunately periodically listen to sports talk radio where now people who have no clue what they're talking about are parroting the worst of talking points out of Florida that have grown so stale. I think the trip, I understand, look, yes, the Castro regime has historically done really repressive things. We saw Obama's excellent dig on Cruz the other day when Cruz suggests that we monitor Muslim neighborhoods. But it's been 60 years, and it hasn't changed anything. And the argument has always been, theoretically, the embargo has failed. The way to open up Cuba is actually to engage them, to force them to have to talk. But we'd only had that in theory, that there's been no effort to try that in practice. And so this trip, I think, represents at least an effort to try something else. And then people say, oh, this is a capitulation. I fail to see why, if this doesn't work, that we can't go back to the other failed policy that hasn't worked. I wouldn't advocate that, but they act like once you walk back from this, you can't ever return to it. But I think we actually saw some real evidence of immediate evidence, and it's who knows how long-term it will be, but things like Obama having a press conference with Raul Castro, who quite clearly did not know how to deal with the press conference because he hasn't had to deal with the press, and it made him look kind of bad. And he even tries to sort of salvage it, right, by grabbing Obama's hand and raising it, and there's Obama beaming, and clearly with the sort of limp wrist, like, you're not getting this sort of symbolic victory from me, right? That's not a good look. And that Obama, I listened to the speech when he delivered it the other day, and here's someone in Cuba in the public saying things like human rights and freedom of the press, right? That these are the kinds of things that get others thrown in jail, but now it's being forced into the political dialogue. And I'm sure Cuba has already begun to sort of try to clamp down on that and put that genie back in a bottle with Obama now going to Argentina. But so what are the long-term impacts on this? We'll see. But I don't even think it's as much about what do the Castros do. They're going to be gone eventually, as impossible as it seems. One day Fidel Castro will probably die, long after we all have, but he will one day die. And there will be a post-Castro situation. That Cuba's been moving towards a post-Castro effort. They've been trying to control that process, right? So diversify a little bit in the Communist Party, set up an apparatus that when the Castros are gone, it can continue. And I'm not saying it will automatically happen, but I'm not also sold that those younger leaders who are rising up in the party, who are expected to sort of govern Cuba once the Castros are gone, I'm not convinced that they're not listening to this and sort of at least considering that this could be operated in a different fashion once the Castros are gone. And I get the whole like, oh, well, it's a repressive regime. Yes, and China and Saudi Arabia and so on and so forth. So, and we work with them. So I think, I get why people, especially those with the past in Cuba, I disagree with their politics, but I get why they have that opinion. But this, I even heard somebody say, oh, well, we're ignoring the Miami Cubans' voices. Well, they've dominated the conversation for 60 years. Let's try something slightly different. And if it doesn't work, we're not ignoring them. We're just saying, all right, you've been shouting the same thing for 60 years. We're going to listen to some other people.
Well, even that voice has become more diversified.
Yes,
right? I mean,
yes, absolutely.
Generational change in the Miami Cubans, right? I mean, and you no longer, right? 15 years ago, you expected a massive flotilla to set forth from Miami when the Castros died, and that's unclear that that's going to happen. Now, right? And there's going to be this very strange thing as Cuba opens up that is going to, in very weird ways, mirror parts of, I think, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where you're going to have the sort of demand for property restitution and so forth from the Miami Cubans. That's never going to happen. But
no.
So it's fascinating stuff.
Yes, absolutely. And I think by doing it too, and it's this trip to Latin America. It may not be coincidental that's in his last year of his presidency, but it's actually kind of a remarkable moment already because I mean, in listening to the speech with Obama the other day, there are parts like, oh, this sounds a lot like presidents across U.S. history with regards to Cuba, and sort of like, let us guide your hand instead of, a slightly paternalistic tone at times. But the fact that he goes to Cuba, first of all, and doesn't shy from it. It's not fly in real quick, press conference and flat, that he's sitting next to Castro at a ball game. And then going to Argentina on the date of the 40th anniversary of the military taking power and ushering in this really horrifically repressive dictatorship. And as a part of that, opening up more promising to declassify more documents in the U.S. about our knowledge of and workings with that dictatorship. It is kind of a really different overall approach to Latin America than a lot of our presidents have demonstrated in the past. So I think it's not, the trip to Cuba in itself is of enormous political, historical, and symbolic importance, but it's not necessarily even an entirely isolated one. That there is this, there are plenty of criticisms to levy against the Obama administration with regards to Latin America, Honduras being the most visible one, perhaps. But that there has been, he came to office saying that he wanted to deal with Latin America more as equals than as the big dog in the yard telling the other dogs what to do. And I think things like this kind of indicate that wasn't cynical or deceptive. That at least in some regards, that has been his approach, and these are sort of two very different manifestations and highly important ones in this sort of U.S.-Latin American relationship between Obama. Again, not to paint it too rosy a picture, but historically, this is kind of a different look than we've done in the past.
Well, I just want to pause, and I know we would have to dig into an entirely new hour. How much were, the United States did not cover itself with glory with respect to Honduras, but how much at odds was it with the rest of Latin America with respect to Honduras, right? I mean, how much conflict was there?
There was a lot of diplomatic, I don't know and we don't know yet what happened behind closed doors necessarily. Lots of Latin America felt that was a coup, and that the United States, while it may not have immediately supported it, it wasn't quick in condemning it, and that Brazil very quickly said Manuel Zelaya is he's the rightful president of Honduras, and a lot of other Latin American countries sort of follow suit. And the United States sort of says, well, let's wait and see what happens to democracy. And then when they do get this sort of government that ends up doing exactly what Zelaya had hoped to have done with the Constitution, but they do it with right-wing people in power who will benefit from this. And they don't bat an eye. It sort of shows the United States did have a massive misstep there, and whether it was calculated or not, there's arguments to be made for both sides right now, and I think it's going to just take more time for those kinds of closed door meetings to come out. But yeah, Latin America, not everyone. Some support. I think Colombia, Colombia was supportive of the United States on that, but much of Latin America immediately said, "This is a coup. There is a rightful president of Honduras, and it's not the interim one, and it's not the one they're about to elect. It's the one who didn't get to finish his term."
All right. Well, Colin, thank you for joining us. It's been fantastic.
Thank you.
And Foreign Entanglements viewers, again, thank you for watching. And come back. And Colin, come back. I know this is maybe the fourth or fifth time we've had you on the show. Yeah. So
I've enjoyed every time, so I'd be glad to talk Latin America every chance I get.
All right. Fantastic. Well, then we will all see you soon.